To talk about how far Apple fell, we have to talk about its first peak in the late 1970s and 1980s. In the early 1970s, Steve and Woz were selling blue boxes for profit. Later on, Steve and Woz started to frequent the Homebrew Club, and from there, Woz showed off the Apple I computer. At this time, Woz already had the idea for the Apple II. However, the two Steves needed to turn a profit before creating this second model. So they sought out Paul Terrell of the Byte Shop, and then Terrell placed an order of 50 Apple I computers at $500 each. Steve and Woz gave him 50 boards, and he was very disappointed, but sold them anyway. This got Jobs thinking about the complete product for normal people, and not boards for a computer enthusiast. The deal with the Byte Shop proved that there was money in this machine and the two Steves. Mike Markkula, who was an early Intel employee who retired a millionaire by the time he met Jobs, secured a $250,000 line of credit and gave them $92,000 of his own money. He also laid out a marketing plan for Apple, being empathy, focus, and impute. Impute being the idea that people judge things by their appearance, something that Jobs held on to for the rest of his life. Markkula also recruited the first CEO for the company, Mike Scott. As to why Jobs wasn't the CEO, Markkula didn't think Jobs was ready for the task and lacked the discipline that Mike Scott acquired at National Semiconductor. Not everyone was celebrating, however. Back at the Homebrew Club, members were not fans of the commercialization of the computer. Free software and open source ethics arose out of this group, and for someone to commercialize this innocent and rebellious endeavor was a betrayal to the ideals of the group. The Homebrew Club was where the hacker ethic and the hippie counterculture converged. Corporations such as IBM were in charge of all of the computers, and for the members of the Homebrew Club to take back the power was very rebellious. A member of the Homebrew Club, Lee Fellenstein, went on to create the Sol 20 of Bob Marsh, a computer that represented the philosophy of the Homebrew Club. Back with the Apple II, software was already starting to be released for business use, such as VisiCalc, an early and powerful spreadsheet software. VisiCalc, developed by Dan Bricklin and Bob Frankston, was only available in the Apple II, so it forced businesses to purchase an Apple. 1980 marked the year Apple went public. The IPO raised $101 million, being the most profitable since Ford in 1956. Stock sold out immediately after the markets opened, valued at $22 a share. By the end of the day, the company was worth almost $1.8 billion. Steve Jobs was now worth over $200 million on paper. At least 40 Apple employees became millionaires, with some numbers placing it at 300. Not all founding members got equal shares, and Wozniak started selling his shares to those who didn't get equal treatment. Markkula's $340,000 investment was now worth over $154 million. The rise of Apple has turned into a myth to better fit with the American dream narrative used to frame entrepreneurship within the United States. While the Apple I was the only computer made in the garage of a then 21-year-old Steve Jobs and a 26-year-old Steve Woz, in popular retellings, it's been expanded to frame Jobs as Wozniak as more like teenagers doing it all through hard work and little external help. Before Apple went public and it was booming with the Apple II, Steve took a visit to the Xerox Palo Alto Research Center in 1979. And Jobs, one of many to see the GUI, became obsessed with the idea and ran with it. This was a mindset change for Jobs, and it influenced the good and bad in the company for the next 15 years. The Lisa, a project in development before the Xerox visit, became a testing ground for the GUI. Steve Jobs, commanding the project, became increasingly erratic and difficult to work with. He was removed from the project by the board early on for how difficult he was to work with. As Jobs roamed the offices trying to find something to work on and take over, he found a Macintosh being led by Jeff Raskin. Macintosh started in 1979 as a passion project on how people interact with machines. Raskin could be described as a polymath. He was a computer scientist, cognitive psychologist, author, and musician. Jobs forced his way onto the project and Raskin resigned in 1981. Jobs wanted the machine to be impactful and beautiful, whereas Raskin wanted it to be cheap and very simple. Before the Mac, Apple had already shown that it could stumble badly. The Apple III, released in 1980, was Apple's attempt to move into the serious business market and take on IBM directly. It was designed by a committee with too many compromises and too many conflicting priorities. Jobs reportedly insisted the machine run without a cooling fan so it could be silent. The result was that chips regularly overheated and literally popped out of their sockets. Apple had to recall all 14,000 units, reseat every chip, and reship them. The fix didn't fully work, and the Apple III's reputation never recovered. It was quietly discontinued in 1984. This was a commercial failure that cost Apple millions of dollars and damaged their credibility in the business market that they were specifically trying to capture with this machine. Back with the Mac, Jobs took over the project, recruiting employees from other projects with the claim that the product was going to make a dent in the universe. He became obsessed with form over function, removing the fan, much like in the Apple III, no cursor keys, underpowered to cut costs. A lot of these issues still haunt Apple today, over 40 years later. But on the other hand, it also adopted newer technologies, such as a 3.5-inch floppy. The Mac was also Jobs' second attempt at the GUI, and early applications made use of it as a core part of the software, like Mac Write and Mac Paint. Apple's own LaserWriter printer, in tandem with PageMaker, also pioneered desktop publishing. The Macintosh was being hyped by Apple to make a dent in the universe. The 1984 Ridley Scott advertisement during the Super Bowl became a classic in popular culture and made the Mac unforgettable. Initially, it sold well, but the software library was thin, and with the single floppy drive, copying files was very tedious. After the first 100 days, the sales dropped. Even though it met the initial units sold, it didn't make it much farther than the initial 70,000 units. Jobs had promised 500,000 units in the first year. The IBM PC and its clones running MS-DOS were selling millions annually. The Apple II, the machine that made Apple, was still selling well as well. But Jobs' priority on the Macintosh and development undercut the Apple II's revisions, like the IIc. The Apple II was still keeping the company afloat, with its significantly larger software library and use in business and homes. Although it wasn't a complete failure, to the board it was. Steve oversold the machine to make it completely change the world. While it did spark some new industries like desktop publishing, one of the markets keeping the Mac platform alive, it didn't see much adoption in business or in the general population. Microsoft Windows, however, saw a huge boom after the Macintosh. Microsoft was given Macintosh computers for their creative software. Microsoft also mimicked how the GUI worked and sold that software for IBM PCs and their compatibles. Apple had granted them access to the Mac, not anticipating for them to use it for themselves, sparking Windows. Windows 1.0 alone wasn't going to kill the Mac, but as Windows continued to be developed, it became a larger and larger competitor to the Mac platform. Within Apple, the Macintosh was causing a fallout between the board and Jobs. John Sculley, who was appointed in 1983 as CEO, coming from Pepsi, initially was very kind to Jobs, with Jobs treating him as a mentor, and they worked together very well. But with the Mac, they were at a breaking point. By 1985, Sculley and Jobs' personal relationship had completely collapsed. Later in the year 1985, Jobs attempted a coup, and the board found out and told Sculley. Then the board stripped him of his duties. By September of 1985, Jobs had resigned from the company and went on to found Next and acquire Pixar after purchasing it from George Lucas. With Jobs gone, the company was actually improving. The Mac II released in 1986 and was very powerful, breaking Jobs' sealed box of a computer, offering expansion slots and color displays. Apple's hold on the education market also started to grow. Unfortunately, due to Sculley's high margin pricing strategy, the Mac platform started to be undercut by IBM PC clones, which were becoming just as powerful as Macintoshes. In 1988, Apple sued Microsoft over copyright infringement in Windows 2.0. Apple argued that Windows 2.0 was a serious infringement of the Mac. This lawsuit didn't fully close out until 1994. The pricing of the Mac hurt its sales. Since Sculley was prioritizing these short-term profits with the high prices, people stopped buying. IBM PCs were cheaper and catching up. A Windows-capable machine could be assembled for under $1,000 in the 90s, and the cheapest Mac was $1,500 more than that. Apple tried new concepts like the Macintosh Portable, a $6,500 16-pound computer that failed. On a technical level, it was very impressive, with a long battery life for the time as well, but with the weight and the price, it sold very poorly, and Apple discontinued the Portable after 2 years of its release. In 1990, Windows 3.0 was released, still not as impressive as the aging System 6 on Mac, but it was an alternative for the normal person wanting to use a computer. Microsoft Office for Windows was also released, previously exclusive to the Mac platform. This pushed the operating system to the business market, something Apple was still never able to fully capture. Apple's market share continued to drop entering the 1990s, coming closer to less than 10% at times. There were some lights in the darkness such as System 7, QuickTime, and the PowerBook. Apple still had it in them to release good products, but it just wasn't enough to rival Microsoft Windows and other competitors like Dell, IBM, and Compaq. By 1992, the lawsuit was ruled in Microsoft's favor, hurting Apple even more. Apple had spent a massive amount of resources on this legal battle, believing that it would rule in their favor, and they continued to appeal and fight it for the next 2 years. Scully started to believe he was the next Steve Jobs and a tech visionary, even though he was just a soda salesman not even a decade prior. In 1993, the Apple Newton was released, being a touchscreen PDA that didn't work well at all, and was very easily mocked. The Simpsons mocked it in Season 6, and it was an overall joke of a product. Ambitious and innovative, yes, but it was far too ahead of its time. The technology was about 15 years too early. The Newton was like Scully's signature product, and its lampooning in the media left him very embarrassed. Apple had laid off 2,500 employees too. The profits were down, and the board lost its confidence in Scully. There were also other failed products, such as the Pink OS disaster ending in 1992, and the Tailgent disaster starting in 1992 and ending in 1997, which was a venture between Apple and IBM to create a next-level operating system for the Macs. Scully was offered a ceremonial role in the company, but he took the hint and resigned. Attack of the Mac clones happened next, with the new CEO Spindler. Apple had looked at the IBM PC clone market of Windows running the entire show, and Spindler thought, well, if you can't beat them, you better join them. This decision was highly disliked internally at Apple. macOS licenses started to be granted in 1994, and by 1995 they were arriving on store shelves. The main clone makers at this time were Power Computing, UMax, and Motorola, who were still making the chips for the Mac. Power Computing was undercutting Apple's own machines, and it became a major problem for Apple's profits. If you saw the Power PC video, then you know that Apple, IBM, Motorola aligned in 1991 to create the AIM Alliance to work on what would become the Power PC chip. This was also released in 1994. If you are so interested, then check out the Power PC video I did a few months ago. If you don't feel like watching it, in short, these chips were powerful and it could rival the Intel chips being released, but with the pricing of the Mac and the limited software compared to the Windows market, it didn't make a reasonable difference. In August of 1995, Windows 95 was released and took even more market share for the Mac. Windows 95 was more impressive and marketable compared to these 6 colors of Apple. Midnight launches in 95, the Empire State Building was lit in the Microsoft colors. Jay Leno even hosted an event for this product too. This was a highly marketable product, and FOMO probably played a part. Much like Nintendo versus Sega, Microsoft marketed its 32 bits over the Mac, which didn't advertise in bits. macOS was 32-bit in some ways. Some parts of the OS ran on 32-bit hardware natively, but other parts were just legacy systems limited by the OS. The Mac had been 32-bit for nearly a decade when Windows 95 released. In a turn of events, Windows had used Marcula's and Steve's philosophy against them. Appearance is everything in marketing. Spindler was working himself to death at Apple, and the clone strategy just wasn't working, so the board let him go in replacement of Gil Amelio. Despite his performance at Apple, he was very respected in the field. He had turned National Semiconductor around, making it profitable. On top of that, he was a highly educated man, with a PhD in physics from Georgia Tech, more than Steve Jobs and Scully ever had. Amelio came in and came to the conclusion that the tech was out of date and needed an update as soon as possible. However, with the maturity of Apple, he didn't mesh very well. He would lead these unfocused presentations consisting of rambling that didn't convey much of anything. The numbers for Amelio were very brutal. Stock prices were now below those at the IPO at just $14 a share. Macs consisted of 3 to 4% of the market share, and the company was just now 90 days away from bankruptcy. Emilio, however, oversaw the NeXT acquisition, the best decision he made and the one that ultimately got him removed from the company within the next few years. The Copeland project, made to succeed macOS 8, had failed, and Emilio had the choice between BOS and NeXT. BOS was being ran by Jean-Louis Gasset, who had been working at Apple from 1981 to 1990. It was a very viable option, and it's also still being continued today as Haiku, in an open source format. NeXT was Steve Jobs' new venture, focusing on high-power workstations. The choice was NeXT, and there now was a light at the end of the tunnel for Apple. The NeXT acquisition brought Steve Jobs back to Apple, and the weight was now on his shoulders to save the company, first as an advisor to Emilio, then becoming interim CEO later in the same year. And that will be covered in the next episode. See what I did there? Everyone who did subscribe is now unsubscribing after that terrible comment. I hope you all enjoyed this video, stick around for more. I'd like to thank you all for watching, thank you members, and until next time, goodbye.